All right, I'm going to jump in and get started. If somebody can give me a sanity check and just let me know they can hear me in the chat, or jump on and turn your audio on and you hear, hey, a thumbs up, that works. Thank you. That works really well. Awesome. I'm gonna get started. So I hope you're in the right session. I think there's only one right now, but this is the feedback that they want to give but won't. So we're going to be covering feedback that people may want to give, but for a few reasons may feel reluctant to actually share. And this can be in organizations big and small, even in internal relationships. So I'm going to jump right in and we'll get started. Helps if I'm on the right page. Whoops. There we go. All right. So first, who am I, and are we enemies? First of all, no, we're not enemies. I'm Blake. My name is Blake Kohler. I'm the CEO of a company called Pulse for Good. For a few of you, I think I just saw you in Wes Meekum, one of my colleagues' presentation, where he's explaining a little bit of how we use tech to achieve some social good by gathering feedback. I'm not really going to cover much of what we actually do. More, I'm going to cover kind of the whys and how you can just with your own organizations and your stuff you're working on yourself, how you can use some of the principles that we use. If you're interested in anything about me, I shared my Twitter and my LinkedIn there. You're more than welcome to hit me up there. I'll share my other contact information in a little bit. But briefly, I am a software developer that somehow started a company and roped some friends into trying to do some good for vulnerable individuals. And so we ran Pulse for Good for about 5 years now, and it's making a lot of progress. I love tech. I love developing. I love building things. I love sports, and I love my two little kids. You can kind of see there. I also love that I have way more gray hair now than I did then, or maybe it's just the light, but it's definitely coming. This is Pulse. So Pulse, we use kiosks that we install in facilities that people are able to give feedback to. Now, the facilities we focus on are where you're going to find really vulnerable groups: homeless, refugees, mental and behavioral health facilities, correctional facilities, those type of groups, and we've got them in literally hundreds of places around the country, and they're gathering data about the satisfaction, the care being offered to them. And it's slowly growing. And we've learned some interesting lessons about when people are willing to share and when people aren't. And that's really the goal of this, is to share some of those lessons. And hopefully you can take some things from it that will be beneficial, and you'll be able to use in your own life. So what I want to do is just give you a quick what to expect. So I'm not going to use the full hour of time here. What I'm expecting is about 30 minutes. And then potentially some times for questions. You are more than welcome to share some questions in the chat, or even chime in during it. I'm happy to answer the questions. Some of the things I'm going to be going over are the accidental defaults that we sometimes set as organizations. The difference between capital V vulnerability and lowercase v vulnerability. The sources of fear for people that are taking surveys or giving feedback. The vulnerability gap, as we call it, and I'll explain more of what that is in a little bit. Tools you can use to actually close the gap. I will warn you, there's a picture of a very large bee in my presentation, and as someone that is terrified of bees, I would have liked that warning. So just forewarn you. And potentially some children walking in. Just, got to be careful. There may be some that pop in. Don't be afraid if all of a sudden one materializes from my background. I'll shoo them away. They'll be fine. So to get started, I don't know how many of you recognize these. These were the crash test dummies that they used in an advertising campaign in the 80s and early 90s to talk about wearing a seatbelt. The reason I brought them up, right, is I want to talk about crash test dummies. It's kind of a weird thing to start with, but crash test dummies are an example of a default. Now, a default is just simply the starting point that an organization tends to choose. Now, crash test dummies originated around the 1960s, became in vogue kind of in the 70s. And what they discovered very early on is that all crash test dummies were basically the same. They had a particular build, particularly in the 60s and into the 70s, where it was the build of an average white male. Now, you may just think about this for a little bit. If you think of the build of an average white male, that probably, if we're being honest, doesn't fit your build. It at least won't fit anyone that identifies as female, and it won't fit any children's build. And so the problems with this is the testing they were doing was making cars safe for one particular group of people. Now, the testing in itself was great. It was good that they were doing this. And this wasn't a purposeful thing. It wasn't a malicious thing. It wasn't something that they were doing because they wanted to build something just for white males that worked. It was just a default that they had chose. They chose this group, this size, particularly because it normally was a bunch of white males that were doing the testing. They picked what was intuitively right for them. The problem is that's not intuitively right for everybody else. And it led to unsafe environments that they're still trying to claw their way out of. In fact, just today, you'll be able to see some crash test dummies where all of a sudden it represents better figures, right? You'll have people that are larger, smaller, all sorts of sizes. In the 1970s, you can see this is the two crash test dummies that they used, right? They upgraded a little bit. There was the male and the female. You'll notice, though, there was still something wrong with their defaults. The male was in the 50th percentile, right? Average American man in the 1950s was 171 pounds, 5 feet 9 inches tall. The average American man. I look at that and say, I'm taller and heavier than that. And so, I start getting a little concerned of, does that fit me? But that's not nearly as bad as when you look at the female over here. The female was the 5th percentile dummy, right? So it fit only females in the 5th percentile and ignored the rest of the population, right? It was 108 pounds. It was 4 feet 11 inches tall. It was based on the 5% smallest women in the 1970s. You can clearly, I think, see some of the issues that may pop up here if you have the wrong default. They had tests that were running to see how safe something is, but it was only really being tested for that small minority group to see if that group was safe. Now, you may be asking, what does this have to do with feedback? What does this have to do with surveys? With surveys, we also set defaults. It happens. And one of the most prominent is the default that gets set for a consumer survey. Now, I'm sure all of you have gotten a survey. That happens. Everyone gets surveys. It's almost impossible not to. In fact, I was going to say the other day, but it was literally a year ago because it was before the restrictions. I was flying into Washington, D.C., and I flew into Ronald Reagan Airport, got off of the plane, took like 4 or 5 steps in the airport, and somebody stopped me, a guy in a suit and tie. He's like, hey, I'd love for you to answer some questions about a survey, take a survey about how your flight was. And I was really kind of blown away that someone cared enough to stop and to gather that information. But it's because they do a lot of complex analysis on how to improve experience at the consumer and the provider level. I love going to Panda Express. It's one of my favorite places to eat. And at the end of each thing, I get a little receipt, and on the back it says, hey, please complete a survey, and you're able to get X, Y, or Z. You notice on the slide, there's the customer satisfaction survey from McDonald's. Everybody's got these surveys. These surveys are interesting, though. They assume that there's an equal power dynamic between the consumer and the producer of the good, right? You both have options to opt out. McDonald's could at any time say, no thanks, I'm not serving you hamburgers. And you could at any time say, I'm never going back to McDonald's. And in both cases, neither of your lives would be adversely affected, I guess, unless you really, really love Big Macs. But honestly, you're not really going to be that affected by not being able to participate or receive those goods anymore, right? That is the default. That's the default assumption of how we think of surveys or gathering feedback is an equal power dynamic. The problem is the default power distribution in things is rarely true across the board, right? It is normally in consumer engagements, which is where most survey tools, most feedback tools are based. They're based on this idea of this equal power dynamic. They're based off the idea of you having a choice of going somewhere else. The question that we try and answer and we deal with is, what happens when you don't have a choice? What happens when you can't go somewhere else? Well, there's not another option, where you couldn't just pick up and say, I'm going to go to the McDonald's down the street. How does that change the power dynamics? So look at this situation. Imagine you're in a vulnerable situation, and you notice it's a capital V, and we'll get to that in a second. In this vulnerable situation, the consumer has far less power than the provider. Now, I'll give you some examples of this in the future, but you may be able to think of some of these situations where the provider has all of the power. There's not a lot of places the consumer could go. The consumer, most of the likely in this situation, can't just pick up and go to the nearest competitor. What that does is it impacts the feedback they're willing to give. That power disparity really messes with what people are willing to say and the feedback they're willing to give. You can see how this is kind of a broken paradigm. The traditional or default method, right, just like those crash test dummies, is an idea of an equal power disparity or an equal power dynamic, no power disparity. The truth is, there's often a power disparity that's extreme in vulnerable situations, but we tend to have used the same old tools to try and gather feedback and then wonder why it doesn't work. So I promised I'd get to this. So vulnerability versus vulnerability. So vulnerability is a bit of a buzzword nowadays. You'll see it all the time. Perhaps there's some Brene Brown fans out there talking about how great it is to be vulnerable, and it is. There's some immense virtues in there, but there's a distinct difference. The vulnerability we experience when we put ourselves out there is a vulnerability we can shut off. We can stop being vulnerable. We can say, I've had enough. I'm good. I'm going home. The vulnerability people experience that we call, capital V vulnerability, is a vulnerability they can't escape. When you're homeless, when you're a refugee, when you're in the correction system, when you're experiencing mental or behavioral health issues, no amount of saying, I'm done, I'm no longer vulnerable, is going to change things. To highlight this, I have a quick story. There was a mayor in Colorado. I think it was in Aurora. I might have the city wrong. But he decided that in order to understand what it was like to live on the streets, he was going to go live on the streets for 3 days. So he packed up a bunch of things into a military pack. Had his phone, had some extra batteries, some water, charger, tent, a bunch of things, and went and lived 3 days out on the streets amongst individuals experiencing homelessness. As he was there, he recorded kind of what he saw and what he thought was going on. And then he came back 3 days later to the city council and said, hey, look, I know how we should solve this. Here's what I saw. Here's what I experienced. And therefore, this is the issues. This is how we should address this. It wasn't until later that somebody pointed him out. There was a distinct difference between what he was doing and what somebody who was actually homeless is experiencing. At any moment, he could say he was done. He could go home back to a warm bed to get the food, the health care, the compassion that he needed. Not to mention, he went into it with military grade equipment, as opposed to most of the time when somebody's homeless, they literally lose everything but the stuff they have on their back. Now, I hope the comparison is fairly easy to see, but I have another story that I think highlights it fairly well. And for anybody in tech, you may be familiar with this little parable. This is the parable of the pig and the chicken. And we often tell this story in Agile to talk about who should be involved in team meetings or other things. But the parable goes a little something like this. There once was a pig and a chicken that wanted to start a restaurant. When the pig asked the chicken what they should call it, the chicken replied, we should call it ham and eggs, clearly implying that the pig will supply the ham and the chicken will supply the eggs. The pig mentioned in here that, this may not be a good idea because while the chicken will be involved, he'll definitely have an input into the process. It'll be the pig that's actually committed, right? There's no way for the pig to emerge out of that situation in a good place. In like measure, when we're talking about vulnerability, capital V vulnerability is the pig. There's no escaping it without completely escaping it. There's no saying I'm done. There's just the work to get out of it. And when we think about that changes, it really changes the power dynamics that exist. Because if I can't escape the vulnerability I'm in, all of a sudden, the fear that I may have associated with that situation can skyrocket incredibly quickly. So I wanted to point out here some fears that come with vulnerability. So some of you are probably familiar with this nice pyramid, right? This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. There is some flaws with this. I want to point that out, that this is not cut and dry, but I do think this is a good way to consider it. The more vulnerable you are, the more base fears influence your decisions, right? So when you are lacking shelter, food, basic safety, sleep, clothing, you're down on those physiological needs. It can be very, very hard to feel safe, to give feedback on the people that are giving you those needs. As you move up that scale, all of a sudden it gets easier and easier to give feedback. It becomes safer and safer because sure, you may lose uh, a friendship, maybe if you're at that level, but by giving poor feedback at that level, you're not going to lose the food that you need to survive. And so when you think about where they're at kind of on this hierarchy of needs, even with its flaws, I think it can give you a good idea of, okay, this is the feedback that we think we're going to get from them. How can this change? How can the situation be a little different because they're vulnerable, because they're fearful? There's a oops, went a little too far here. There's a movie that my children have watched way too much of, and you guys probably have seen it too many times too. There's Frozen, and as a worker in tech, I once worked in a leadership position, and as we talk about people and we talk about why they were making bad choices, I had a friend that would bring up this quote from Frozen often, right? And the quote was, "People make," it's a song. I will not sing it. I want people to enjoy this. People make bad choices if they're mad or scared or stressed. You may remember the next line is, and throw a little love their way and they'll make up the rest. Right. And so we talk about that as people were struggling, that, that if they are mad or scared or stressed, that's probably why they're struggling. And so we worked as leaders to try and remove those three things. Can we help them not be mad? Can we help them not be scared, or help them not be stressed? Well, when you're vulnerable, you tend to be all three things at the same time constantly. I have a little addendum here, as you may see, to this quote, that people make bad choices when they're mad or scared or stressed. They also give pretty crappy feedback. And that's just a truism that we found across the board, that if they are upset, the feedback that you're going to get isn't going to be constructive. If they are scared, they're not going to give good feedback. And if they're stressed, they're not going to give good feedback. And so the goal is, how do we remove those things? Now, we talked about the power disparity that exists. Think about flipping that on that side, right? And instead of having it between a consumer and a producer, between any two groups, right? And there's the column that is the feedback you want to give, and the other column is the feedback you feel comfortable giving. The difference between those is what we call the vulnerability gap, right? There's a few different situations that I'll describe in here, but one of the most important things that I want you to take away from this is to understand the vulnerability gap basically exists in every relationship. It's just the gap is wider or smaller based off of certain things. For those groups that we talked about that are vulnerable, the gap can be extremely large. For those in a tight relationship, for instance, like a husband and wife or friends, you can have a very small vulnerability gap where you're willing to share almost everything with each other. So here's a few examples. This one is the one that resonates with the most amount of people, right? You have the power disparity between an employee and an employer. Now, the employee has the ability to leave and go somewhere else. And this changes a little bit based off the socioeconomical spectrum that you're in. If you're in poverty and an employee, you have less of an ability to be able to change jobs or go somewhere else. Missing a paycheck can be so detrimental that maybe the employer has an even greater power disparity over you. But I think we've all been in that situation where you have a boss that asks for feedback and you're uncomfortable giving them the honest opinion that you have. If you haven't had that opportunity yet, I promise you will, because it happens. It's just all over the place. Right. And so a lot of times what the employee does is they give half feedback. They allude to things. They kind of dance around the issues. Right. But it's a common problem of, how do you get real good feedback from employees when you're an employer and you have this power disparity? Another example, which is common to talk about right now, is the difference in between a police officer and a citizen, right? Large power disparity. Think about the next time you get pulled over. How comfortable would you be telling the police officer they're doing a crappy job? Now, there are people that are going to do that. But I think in general, most people will be a little afraid to provide that feedback to a police officer. Now, to some of the police officers' credits, we worked with a few groups that have actually started trying to find ways to be able to get feedback in these situations. The Highway Patrol in the state of Utah has actually started looking at giving out business cards with on the back of it a QR code for people to scan to be able to go give feedback. And so they're taking steps in that direction. But that power disparity is extreme in that situation. And and can get more extreme based off of other situations that can be exacerbate the problem. You have issues of race or ethnicity or gender can make all of these things. The power disparities can increase or decrease based off of some of those. And so it can become extreme in any situation there. The third example, and I want you to think about this one for just a second, is a refugee and an immigration officer. Imagine being a refugee and getting to the border of a country you'd like to come into and having that interview with an immigration officer. Now imagine being asked to give feedback about that process. How comfortable would you be? You are fleeing something. That's the point of being a refugee. It's not just you're immigrating for fun. You're fleeing something. The confines of where you're trying to go are desperately needed, right? That's why you've tried to get there. Are you willing to put your safety or your future security at risk to give feedback? It's a really hard thing. But for those immigration officers, in order to improve, you need that feedback. I think it is a great example of that vulnerability gap, right? The feedback you want to give and what you're willing to give could be miles apart in that situation. I notice me dodging the bee that's on my screen right now. I hate bees. They're just horrible, awful things sent from God to torture us, I'm pretty sure. And my daughter likes to find pictures of bees on the phone and show them to me because she knows that I hate them. But my point in showing these here is there's rational fears and there's irrational fears. My fear of bees is fairly irrational. I'm not allergic. I've been stung. I have no idea. They just creep me the heck out. But it's still a fear. Just because it's irrational doesn't mean it's not a fear. There's also rational fears where I once ran into a bear while hiking in Wyoming and was very afraid. And I think that was a very rational fear to have, right? And so those two things, the rational fears and irrational, cause in a lot of ways the same reaction. My reaction was to get the heck out of there. The reason I bring this up is in lots of organizations, there's this idea that, well, my organization, people trust us, or they would never, be afraid of us, or not give feedback. Or even if you're a boss, you may be in that situation where it's like, well, of course people would talk to me, because it's not, I'm never going to do anything that's going to hurt them. But that's where that irrational fear comes in. People may know that you may have their best interests at heart. It doesn't mean they may not be afraid. And that fear, however irrational, may still impact the feedback they're willing to give. So if you look at each of these, I think in each of these, the fear could maybe be a bit irrational. Honestly, a refugee may be able to give an immigration officer feedback and be just fine. A citizen might be able to tell a police officer how they feel and be just fine. An employee often can tell an employer how they feel and be completely fine, but it doesn't matter. If their fear is there and it prevents them from doing it, you have the vulnerability gap, whether it's rational or not. So the question that I think, or at least I hope all of you are at now is, how do you close the gap, right? Like, I hope I've explained it well enough to say this is an issue. It exists in almost every organization. How do you get rid of it? Which is really the same thing as asking, what can you do to help people feel safe? That's really what it is. The first thing you can do is you can think about what helps you feel safe and try and implement some of those. I'm going to share 3 things that have worked well for us. They are not the totality of it. There's other things you could do to help provide psychological safety or occasionally physical safety for people and help them feel safe enough to give feedback. But I'm going to talk about 3 in particular that have worked. And so the 3 we found are utilizing technology, and I'll touch on each of these in more detail in just a second, providing anonymity, and building relationships. So first, using technology. Technology can be a double-edged sword when it comes to feedback. It can be a way to provide people with physical distance, which sometimes is a need for safety. It may be really hard to sit in the same room as your boss and give them direct feedback, but you might be able to send the email. That physical distance can help. At the same time, sometimes technology can be a detriment. It can be something where people feel like you're faking caring about people. And so you have to be careful with it. But in general, we found if you can use technology as a bit of a barrier and a buffer, it will allow people to feel safer to be able to share how they really feel. The the second thing is providing anonymity. And I love this meme right on the internet. No one knows you're a dog. Um, I assume dogs give great feedback on the internet. But we found is anonymity is one of the absolute best ways to be able to allow people to give feedback. And this isn't a new thing. If you think of a whole bunch of different situations, and I'll just allude to a few of them. One, think of whistleblowers in the government, right? The whole ability for you to come forward and say, I'm going to share this thing and remain anonymous and potentially get some sort of reward is built around this anonymity that you'll be protected. And if you're eventually revealed there, there's things in place to be able to help you in that regard too. Another good example is the witness protection program, right? Where you may not have complete anonymity, but you're going to be provided the anonymity to keep you safe from whatever the thing is that could cause you harm there. And so we use anonymity in society all the time. And truthfully, we can use anonymity even better as we gather feedback from vulnerable groups, from all sorts of groups around the country and around the world. One thing you do have to be careful of is fake anonymity. I once participated in a survey where, as a leader, we sent out a survey to a bunch of employees. It all came back. We started reading them and immediately started to identify people based off of what they said. And so that's fake anonymity. That's me saying this is anonymous, but it's not really anonymous. And so you can do some things to make sure that things aren't completely that you can do some things to be able to detect their anonymity based off of the way you aggregate the data, how you distribute it, and how you ask certain questions. All can make sure that people don't have to reveal themselves through this process of giving feedback. Anonymity can help close that gap immensely. The last one is building relationships. And I knew I said this would take about 30 minutes, and I promise we're getting fairly close here. But building relationships is the absolute best way to close the gap, a vulnerability gap. There's no better way to help people feel comfortable to give feedback than having a good relationship with them and building internal trust. There's just not. The problem with building relationships is it just doesn't scale super well. You may be able to have great relationships with 100 people, but can you do it with 1,000? Right. And as an organization, that becomes a problem. When I'm serving 500 people, I can't have a great relationship with each of them. And so I can't necessarily expect that each of them are going to be able to have great feedback for me. This is especially prominent, I think, in relationships with spouses or others, right? You get to a point where you can share really good feedback really quickly. And that's the goal. We never want to supplement or excuse me, supplant. You do want to supplement. You don't want to supplant relationships with technology or with anonymity, because human interaction is the best. There's no substitute for it. But if you can build relationships and then scale it out using technology and using anonymity, you're really on a path to be able to close that gap in a way that will work for almost any organization. I have a bonus one. Asking safe questions. So the funny one that I think always comes up here is the question of, does this dress make me look fat? That is not a safe question, no matter how close that vulnerability gap is, right? There's other less funny safe questions. In fact, they get so less funny that they border on abusive, right? And so making sure that you're asking a question that actually helps people be safe is a huge thing in trying to close that gap. All the work that you do using technology, anonymity, relationships can be undone by asking one stupid question. Making sure your questions are safe is the bonus tip, but is also just a prerequisite. Make sure you don't ask stupid things. It really can disrupt everything you're trying to do and break down the trust that you're building over time. In closing, I just want to share this. I run a podcast, and I had a privilege of interviewing somebody the other day that deals with many vulnerable people. And he told me the story of him being a chaplain on a boat. And while he was on the chaplain of the boat, his commanding officer came to him and said, "Hey," he actually said, "I hate you." And the chaplain said that took him back a little bit. You never want anybody to say, "I hate you," least of all your commanding officer. And the chaplain said, "No, why? Why do you hate me?" And he said, "I hate you because I have a hard time being mad at you because you're amazing at helping the ones and tens of people, but I need you to help the hundreds and thousands." That story struck me because so much in what we do in social enterprises, in nonprofits, in tech for good, we're great at helping the ones and tens of people. We could be much better at helping the hundreds and thousands. And so I hope that this explanation of the vulnerability gap and some of the things you can do to close it can help you figure out how you can scale your own impact more, or the impact of other groups that you engage with or around. Because there's so much wrong in life right now. We need to make larger impacts than we're doing. We need to do them at scale. We need to do them in ways that help people feel safe. Lastly, this is what you're going for, right? You want people to feel safe in your organization, in your presence, no matter what it be. You may not run a nonprofit. You may work for a for-profit. You may have a team of 5. You still have the same problem. If you make them feel safe and make them trust you, things will work better. You'll get better feedback, and feedback is what drives the engine of improvement forward. To end this, this is one of our favorite sayings here, and we do a little bit of swag. So if anybody's interested, you can visit pulseforgood.com/magnet. But it says the first duty of love is to listen. And it's something I really believe, right? That we need to listen better to people, not just more, not just listen at all. We need to be better about listening. And part of that includes making sure people feel safe to share what they need to share. When we do that, our organizations improve, people around us improve, we improve, and the world improves. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to take them. And you're also more than welcome to reach out and contact me at my email address there. I'll take any questions now. I'll wait around for a few minutes. If anybody has some, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you for the kind comments in the chat, by the way. I appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for attending. All right. Well, if nobody has any other questions, I'll go ahead and end this meeting. Feel free to reach out via email. And thank you again, everybody, for the kind words on chat. I hope the presentation helped in some small way.